Awakening often feels nothing like what people expect. It doesn't feel like clarity. It doesn't feel like peace. And it certainly doesn't feel like becoming more spiritual. For many people, awakening feels like losing everything. You lose the version of yourself that knew who they were. You lose the life that once made sense. You lose relationships that no longer recognize you. And perhaps most painfully, you lose the illusions that once kept you safe. No one prepares you for this part. We are told that awakening is about light, expansion, and higher consciousness. But what is rarely spoken about is the moment when the ground beneath your life collapses, not because you failed, but because something in you has outgrown the structure you were living in. Carl Jung once wrote that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. And this is where awakening truly begins. Because awakening is not about becoming someone new. It is about becoming conscious of what you have been avoiding, suppressing, or living through unconsciously. And that process is destabilizing. At first, it often shows up as exhaustion, a deep, bone-level fatigue that rest doesn't seem to fix. Your body slows down. Your motivation disappears. Things you once cared about suddenly feel empty or meaningless. People around you may tell you that you are depressed, ungrateful, or lost. But what is actually happening is far more subtle and far more radical. The old identity that carried you through life is dissolving. The role you played to survive, to belong, to be loved, is no longer sustainable. And when that role falls apart, it can feel like you are falling apart with it. This is often the moment people try to go back. They try to force themselves into old routines, old relationships, old versions of productivity and purpose. But awakening does not work that way. Once consciousness has shifted, there is no real return to unconsciousness. You may try to pretend. You may try to numb yourself. You may even succeed for a while. But something inside you knows. The old life no longer fits, and that realization can feel terrifying. Because if you are no longer who you were, and you are not yet who you are becoming, then who are you? This in-between space is where many people believe something has gone wrong. They think they are broken. They think they are regressing. They think they have lost themselves. But from a Jungian perspective, this liminal state is not a failure. It is a threshold. The ego, the structure that once organized your life, is losing its central position. And when the ego loosens its grip, the unconscious begins to speak louder, through dreams, through emotions that feel disproportionate, through physical symptoms, through sudden grief, anger, or longing, without a clear object. This is not pathology. This is psyche reorganizing itself. Awakening feels like losing everything because everything you built your identity on was never the whole of who you are. And the psyche knows it. One of the most confusing aspects of awakening is that it often doesn't begin in the mind. It begins in the body. Your body starts to say no before your mind understands why. You feel heavy, tense, inflamed, exhausted. Sleep no longer restores you. Your nervous system feels raw, overstimulated, or strangely numb. From the outside, it may look like something is wrong. But from a depth psychological perspective, the body is responding to an inner shift that the ego has not yet integrated. For years, sometimes decades, the body carries what the psyche cannot consciously hold. Unlived emotions, suppressed anger, unspoken grief, chronic self-betrayal. Awakening brings these layers to the surface. Jung understood the body as deeply symbolic. When consciousness expands too quickly for the ego to keep up, the tension does not disappear. It moves into the soma. This is why awakening is often accompanied by physical symptoms: tightness in the chest, the throat, the solar plexus, headaches, neck and shoulder pain, digestive issues, a sense of being constantly on edge. Your system is recalibrating. The old way of being in the world was built on adaptation, not authenticity. You learn to function, to perform, to please, to endure. And now, the body refuses to continue that contract. This refusal can feel like betrayal, especially for people who have always been strong, capable, reliable. But in truth, the body is not collapsing. It is setting a boundary your consciousness could not yet set. At the same time, relationships begin to change. Not all at once, not dramatically at first, but subtly, unmistakably. Conversations feel shallow or strained. You feel unseen even when you are surrounded by people. The roles you once played, the listener, the caretaker, the peacemaker, suddenly feel unbearable. And this can evoke enormous guilt, because awakening does not only affect you, it destabilizes relational systems that depended on you staying the same. When you awaken, you no longer unconsciously agree to contracts you never consciously chose. And those contracts often live inside relationships. Jung spoke of the persona, the social mask we wear to belong. During awakening, the persona begins to crack. You may notice that people respond differently to you, even if you haven't done anything. They sense the shift. The unconscious always does. Some will try to pull you back into your old role. Some will accuse you of changing, becoming distant, selfish, or cold. Some will quietly disappear. This loss can be devastating, because awakening often removes the very sources of validation that once made life feel stable. You may lose approval. You may lose certainty. You may lose people you thought would always be there, and yet, this loss is not random. It reveals which connections were built on authenticity and which were built on unconscious need. This is why awakening feels like losing everything. It strips away what was familiar before it gives you anything new. The psyche does not offer immediate replacements. It creates space. And space feels like emptiness to an ego that has been defined by doing, achieving, and relating. In this phase, many people feel a profound sense of loneliness, even when they are not alone. Not the loneliness of isolation, but the loneliness of no longer being mirrored by the old world. You are standing between identities, between lives, between ways of being. Jung described this as a necessary disorientation, a period in which the ego must lose its dominance so a deeper organizing principle can emerge. But this process is slow, and it cannot be forced. This is why awakening so often triggers anxiety. The ego experiences this dissolution as a threat. It asks relentlessly, "What is my purpose now? Who am I without my roles? How will I survive if I don't know where I'm going?" And the psyche does not answer with logic. It answers with images, feelings, dreams. This is the phase where people often seek quick spiritual answers. They want reassurance, certainty, timelines. But awakening is not linear. It is cyclical, spiral-like. You may feel moments of clarity followed by long stretches of confusion, moments of peace followed by deep grief. This is not regression. It is integration. What is dying is not your life. It is the false center around which your life was organized. And death, even symbolic death, is never comfortable. At a certain point in awakening, many people reach a place where even the idea of growth begins to feel hollow. You've done the inner work. You've reflected, you've become more conscious, and yet life does not seem to move forward. This is often the phase people describe as the dark night of the soul. But from a Jungian perspective, the dark night is not a punishment or a spiritual failure. It is what happens when the old ego-driven orientation dissolves, and a deeper center has not yet fully emerged. In other words, you no longer know how to live from who you were, but you cannot yet live from who you are becoming. Direction disappears. Goals that once motivated you now feel meaningless. External success feels strangely empty. Even spiritual language can begin to feel insufficient or false. This is deeply unsettling for the ego, because the ego wants progress. It wants movement. It wants reassurance that this suffering has a purpose. But the psyche is not interested in reassurance. It is interested in truth. And truth often requires a period of not knowing. Jung spoke of individuation as the process by which a person becomes psychologically whole, not by perfecting the ego, but by relativizing it. During individuation, consciousness is gradually decentered. Life is no longer organized solely around control, achievement, or external validation. And when that center shifts, the old compass stops working. This is why awakening often feels like being lost at sea. The maps you were given no longer apply. The strategies that once kept you safe no longer function. Many people panic at this stage and try to rebuild their old life with new spiritual language. They try to force purpose. They try to manifest clarity. They try to think their way out of a process that cannot be solved intellectually. But awakening does not respond to force. The psyche asks for surrender, not resignation, but a willingness to stay present in uncertainty. This is incredibly difficult in a culture that values clarity, productivity, and visible progress. And yet, this suspension is not empty. Something is happening beneath the surface. Jung often used the metaphor of alchemy to describe inner transformation. In alchemy, the nigredo, the blackening, is the stage where old forms decompose. Nothing looks alive. Nothing looks valuable. But this decomposition is essential. Without it, no new form can emerge. Awakening includes a psychological nigredo, a period where meaning collapses, identities dissolve, and the psyche turns inward. You may feel drawn to solitude. You may feel overwhelmed by noise, demands, and expectations. Your sensitivity increases. This is not weakness. It is perception refining itself. The unconscious is closer to the surface now, and with it come truths that were previously inaccessible. This is also the phase where old wounds resurface with surprising intensity. Childhood pain, attachment patterns, unresolved grief. Not because you are going backward, but because consciousness is finally strong enough to hold them. Awakening strips away distraction, and what remains is what still needs to be integrated. This is why the process can feel endless. But there is a subtle shift that begins to occur, not in the form of answers, but in the form of a different relationship to the questions. You begin to tolerate not knowing. You begin to listen instead of forcing. You begin to sense that life is reorganizing itself from a deeper place. This is the beginning of a new center of gravity. You are no longer driven primarily by fear, approval, or survival. Even if those forces still appear, they no longer define you completely. Something quieter, more grounded begins to emerge, not as certainty, but as orientation. What people rarely tell you is that awakening does not arrive as a breakthrough. It arrives quietly, after the collapse, after the confusion, after you have stopped trying to fix yourself. At some point, without any dramatic moment, you begin to notice a subtle shift. You are still tired, but the exhaustion feels different, less frantic, less desperate. You still don't have all the answers, but the urgency to have them has softened. This is the moment a new center begins to form. Not an ego center built on control or identity, but a deeper organizing principle Jung referred to as the self. The self is not an ideal version of you. It is not a perfected personality. It is the totality of who you are, conscious and unconscious. And when life begins to reorganize around this deeper center, something fundamental changes. You stop trying to prove your worth. You stop chasing meaning outside yourself. You stop forcing alignment. Instead, you begin to listen. Meaning no longer comes from ambition or approval. It comes from resonance. You start to notice what drains you, and you no longer argue with it. You notice what feels quietly alive, and you allow yourself to follow it, even if it makes no sense yet. This is why awakening often looks unproductive from the outside. You may do less. You may speak less. You may choose simplicity over expansion. But internally, something essential is taking shape. Your nervous system slowly recalibrates. Your body begins to trust again, not because life is safe, but because you are no longer abandoning yourself. Boundaries emerge naturally, not as defenses, but as clarity. You no longer explain yourself endlessly. You no longer overextend to be understood. You allow misunderstandings to exist without immediately correcting them. This can feel unsettling at first, because the old self survived by adjusting, pleasing, anticipating. The new self survives by being anchored. Relationships continue to shift during this phase. Some connections deepen, not because they are perfect, but because they can hold truth. Others fall away, not dramatically, but quietly. You grieve these losses differently now, not as proof that you are unlovable, but as evidence that you are no longer living unconsciously. And this is one of the most painful and liberating realizations of awakening. Some people were only meant to walk with you while you were asleep. This does not make them wrong, and it does not make you superior. It simply means the inner contract has changed. Jung warned that individuation often leads to a sense of isolation, not because you are disconnected, but because you are no longer merged. You stand more fully in yourself, and from that place, connection becomes more real, not based on need or fear, but on choice. Life also begins to ask different things of you. Instead of, "What should I do with my life?" the question becomes, "What wants to be lived through me?" This is a profound shift, because it moves you out of force and into dialogue with life. You may feel drawn to creative expression, to simplicity, to service, to silence. You may not yet know how this fits into a career or identity, and that's okay. Awakening does not rush. It unfolds in rhythms, in seasons. What matters is not speed, but integrity. The psyche now values truth over performance, alignment over appearance. And while this path is quieter, it is far more stable, because it is rooted in something that cannot be taken away. Final part. Awakening is not the end. Awakening feels like losing everything because, in a way, it is. You lose illusions. You lose false certainty. You lose identities that were never fully yours. But what you gain is not something flashy or dramatic. You gain contact. Contact with yourself, with your inner life, with reality as it actually is, not as you were taught to survive it. Jung never described awakening as happiness. He described it as wholeness, and wholeness includes grief, includes fear, includes uncertainty, but it also includes depth, meaning, and a quiet strength that does not depend on external validation. If you are in a phase where it feels like everything has fallen apart, where you feel lost, exhausted, or unrecognizable to yourself, it does not mean you are failing. It may mean you are awakening, not into light, but into truth. And truth, while painful at first, is the only ground solid enough to build a life that is truly your own. If this resonates with you, take your time with it. You don't need to rush your becoming. And if you want to explore more depth psychology, Jungian insights, and the inner processes behind transformation, you're welcome to subscribe to this channel. We go slowly here, and we go deep.